It was one of those mornings when the world felt softer than usual. The air outside was cool, touched by the scent of ocean salt, and the sky above the little town of Windermere wore a pale shade of blue. Emily Hart stood by her grandmother's old window, watching the seagulls drift above the quiet harbor, their wings glinting in the early sun. The house around her creaked gently, every sound filled with the memories of a life long lived. She hadn't been back here in years. Windermere was the kind of town that stayed still, where every porch held a rocking chair, every street knew your name, and the ocean spoke louder than people ever did. Emily had once dreamed of leaving this place forever, but now, at 32, she'd returned with a heart heavy from too many almosts. Almost married, almost happy, almost sure of her future. She told herself she'd come back just to clean out her grandmother's home, to sort through the boxes, the photos, the faded reminders of time. But deep down, she knew there was another reason. A quiet part of her was searching for something she couldn't name. Maybe peace, maybe clarity, maybe the version of herself she'd lost somewhere between city lights and broken promises. As she moved through the old living room, sunlight danced across the dust floating in the air. The place smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, just the way she remembered. On the mantel sat the same porcelain clock that used to lull her to sleep when she was a child. Emily smiled sadly. "You'd laugh at me, Grandma. Coming back like this, trying to start over." Outside, the wind brushed against the window panes, carrying the distant sound of waves. It was the same sound that had once comforted her on nights when she felt alone, when her parents argued, when she dreamed of leaving town, when her heart first learned what longing meant. Her grandmother, Margaret Hart, had always been the keeper of calm, a quiet woman with kind eyes and a voice that could turn worry into peace. She'd raised Emily after her father left, and though she rarely spoke about the past, there was always something wistful behind her smile, like she carried a secret too precious or too painful to tell. Now walking through these empty rooms, Emily felt that silence everywhere. In the bedroom, she began sorting through drawers and boxes, wrapping fragile trinkets in tissue paper. Each object told a story. A silver hairpin, an old journal, a seashell necklace. And then, behind a framed photograph of her grandmother as a young woman, Emily's hand brushed against something she hadn't noticed before. It was a yellowed envelope, tucked neatly behind the frame. Her grandmother's handwriting, elegant and looping, filled the front. "To my daughter, Ellen," it said. Emily froze. Her mother's name? The envelope had never been opened. Its seal was still unbroken, its edges soft with age. She turned it over in her hands, her pulse quickening. Why had her grandmother written this and never sent it? And why was it hidden away behind a photograph? She sat on the edge of the bed, the letter resting in her lap. For a moment, she felt the weight of years pressing down on her. There was something about this house, about being here again, that made time blur. It was as if her grandmother's presence lingered in the walls, watching her, guiding her, whispering softly, "Not yet." She looked toward the window. Outside, the sea stretched endlessly, calm and blue. The breeze carried the faint cry of a gull, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she could almost hear her grandmother's voice, gentle, familiar, loving. What did you want to tell her? And why couldn't you? The question hung in the still air, unanswered. She placed the letter back on the nightstand, but couldn't walk away. Her curiosity began to stir, not in a way that felt nosy or impatient, but in a way that came from love. She had always admired her grandmother's grace, her ability to keep the family together even when everything else seemed uncertain. But now, she couldn't help wondering if that strength had come at a cost. Maybe, she thought, every family has a secret, something left unspoken to protect the ones they love. Emily spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through old belongings, yet her thoughts kept returning to that letter. By evening, the sky had turned gold, and a soft light poured across the wooden floors. She made herself a cup of tea, sat by the same window where she'd watched the sunrise, and held the envelope again. Her fingers traced the edges slowly, almost tenderly. She didn't open it, not yet, but something inside her shifted. For the first time in years, Emily felt a quiet pull, a sense that her life was about to change, not because of something she'd planned, but because of something hidden that wanted to be found. As night fell and the waves whispered against the shore, she closed her eyes and listened. The house was silent. The envelope remained unopened.
But in that stillness, a story began, one that had waited decades to be heard. Morning light poured softly through the lace curtains, painting gentle patterns across the floor. Emily stirred from sleep, the sound of distant waves murmuring like a lullaby she'd known all her life. For a moment, she forgot where she was, until her eyes found the envelope resting on the nightstand, the letter, the one written to her mother, sealed decades ago. She stared at it, wondering again what truth it held. But something in her heart told her the answer wasn't inside those pages alone. Sometimes finding truth meant listening to echoes, to the quiet places where memory still spoke. That afternoon, she decided to walk through Windermere to see what had changed and what had stayed the same. The town was peaceful, as always. The bakery still had its bell above the door. The same fishermen sat by the dock, mending nets with patient hands. The smell of sea salt and old wood filled the air, warm and familiar. As she wandered past the small public library, she paused. The building's white paint had faded a little, but its charm remained. Tall windows, flower pots on the steps, the faint hum of a world that moved slower than the rest. She remembered coming here as a girl with her grandmother, sitting at the long oak table while Margaret read her stories about courage, kindness, and love that never gave up. Out of curious curiosity, Emily stepped inside. The air was cool and filled with the scent of old paper and polished wood. Behind the front desk stood a man, sorting books, tall, with calm eyes and a quiet presence. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "Hi there," he said gently. "Haven't seen you around before." "I used to live here, a long time ago." "Then welcome home," he said, and there was something in his voice, a warmth that made her pause. His name was Daniel Reed, a volunteer historian who'd moved to Windermere a few years ago. He loved stories, not the kind found in fiction, but the ones buried in people's memories, tucked away in letters, photos, and forgotten corners of town. They talked for a while, first about books, then about Windermere, and finally about her grandmother. Daniel's eyes softened when she mentioned Margaret Hart. "I knew her," he said quietly. "She used to visit the library often, always left with more books than she could carry." Emily smiled. "That sounds like her." There was a kindness in Daniel's eyes, the kind that didn't demand anything, just offered understanding. Something about him felt familiar, like an echo she couldn't place. Their conversation flowed easily, as if they'd known each other in another time, another life. Days passed, and Emily found herself returning to the library, sometimes with a purpose, sometimes without. She and Daniel would talk for hours about old love letters found in archives, about the history of Windermere's lighthouse, about the way time seems slower by the sea. It wasn't romance, not in the way movies told it. It was gentler than that, a quiet companionship that felt safe. Two souls drawn together not by spark, but by silence that didn't need to be filled. One afternoon, while helping Daniel organize local records, Emily found a faded photograph of the town from 50 years ago. Her grandmother stood in the center, young and smiling, and beside her was a man Emily didn't recognize. Daniel leaned closer to look. He frowned slightly. He said, "That's my father."
Emily turned to him. "Your father?" Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the photo as if seeing it for the first time. "I didn't know they knew each other." There was a flicker of something unspoken in his voice, surprise, maybe even confusion. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The air in the room felt different, heavier somehow, filled with questions neither of them could yet form. Emily thought back to the hidden letter, the one addressed to her mother. Could this be connected? The thought lingered quietly in her mind, but she didn't mention it, not yet. That evening, she walked home along the coast road, the sunset casting long, golden ribbons across the sea. The air was cool and sweet, filled with the scent of salt and pine. She thought of Daniel, of his calm voice, his quiet understanding, the way he listened like every word mattered. And she thought of her grandmother, of the mysteries that lingered in her gentle smile. Emily realized that life often circled back on itself. The past never really disappeared. It just waited patiently for the right moment to be remembered. That night, as the waves whispered against the rocks below, Emily sat again by the window of her grandmother's house. The envelope still lay on the table beside her cup of tea. She ran her fingers across its fragile paper, her mind filled with images of a young woman standing by the sea. Her grandmother, perhaps, watching someone she loved walk away. The moonlight touched the letter softly, almost like a blessing. Emily took a deep breath and whispered into the quiet, "Whatever you were protecting, Grandma, I'll understand it, I promise." Outside, the tide pulled gently against the shore, carrying the echoes of a story that wasn't finished yet. A story written in silence, sealed in love, and waiting to be found. The following morning, Windermere awoke to a light mist that rolled in from the sea, soft and silver like a dream that hadn't yet ended. Emily walked through the fog toward the library, her coat wrapped tightly around her. The world felt quiet, blurred at the edges, as if time itself had slowed to listen. She hadn't planned on seeing Daniel again so soon, but something in her heart urged her back, a quiet pull she couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was curiosity about that photograph, or maybe it was something gentler, something that came from the comfort of being understood. When she stepped inside the library, Daniel was already there, sitting near the tall windows, surrounded by stacks of papers and old town records. The morning light filtered through the glass, catching the faint dust in the air. He looked up and smiled when he saw her, a small, genuine smile that felt like home. "You're early," he said softly. "So are you," she replied. They both laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that feels shared, not loud or sudden, but easy. The kind that happens when two people feel safe enough to just be themselves. Daniel pushed aside a few papers and gestured toward the seat across from him. "I've been going through more archives. I think I found something about your grandmother." Emily sat down, her heart catching a little at his words. "What did you find?" He handed her a folded document, a town event record from 1974. There, listed among volunteers for the annual lighthouse restoration project, were two familiar names, Margaret Hart and William Reed. "My father," Daniel said quietly, "and your grandmother. They worked together that summer." Emily traced the names with her finger. "I didn't know she ever volunteered for anything outside the church." Daniel nodded. "Neither did I. My dad never talked much about that time. He passed away when I was in college, and there were things I never got to ask." Silence settled between them,
not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing a pale sky over the harbor. The sound of a bell from a nearby boat drifted through the air. Emily looked up from the paper. "Maybe they were friends," she said softly. "Maybe," Daniel replied, his gaze distant. "Or maybe it was something more. Something they couldn't talk about." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emily felt a wave of tenderness, not for the mystery itself, but for the people who had once lived it. Her grandmother, graceful and quiet. Daniel's father, a man she'd never known, but whose story now brushed gently against her own. She wondered what it must have been like. Two people meeting under the same sky, bound by timing and circumstance. How easily a small choice could echo through generations. Daniel cleared his throat and smiled faintly. I can't stop thinking about that photograph. The way they were standing, it wasn't random. They were close, almost as if they were trying not to be noticed, but still wanted to be near each other. Emily smiled softly. "You noticed that too?" He nodded. Maybe that's what history is. Noticing the small things that everyone else missed. Their eyes met for a moment. There was no rush, no intensity, just quiet understanding. Two people carrying pieces of a story they didn't yet know fully. Later that day, they decided to visit the lighthouse, the same one their grandparents had once helped restore. The path was lined with wildflowers, swaying gently in the wind. The sea stretched endlessly before them, silver and blue beneath the afternoon sun. When they reached the top of the hill, the lighthouse stood tall and weathered, its white paint faded but still proud against the horizon. Daniel brushed a bit of dust from an old plaque by the entrance, reading the engraved names aloud. "Margaret Hart," he said, smiling, "and William Reed, right next to each other."
Emily stood quietly, the wind tugging at her hair. They must have stood here once, maybe even looking at this same view. Daniel turned toward the ocean. Funny how the world keeps turning, but some things never really end. They stayed there for a while, watching the waves crash gently against the rocks below. Emily felt something shift within her, not a sharp ache, but a slow, tender ache of recognition. It wasn't about romance or longing. It was about connection, the invisible threads that tie one life to another across years, choices, and silences. As the sun began to sink lower, painting the sky in soft shades of peach and gold, Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you ever feel like the past doesn't stay buried because it still has something to teach us?" Emily nodded slowly. "All the time." The wind carried their words out to sea, as if the waves themselves were listening. When they walked back toward town, the first evening lights flickered in the distance. Emily glanced at Daniel beside her, his quiet stride, his calm smile. She didn't know where this path was leading, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't need to. Some stories, she realized, don't rush toward an ending. They unfold softly, like the tide, revealing a little more each time it returns. And as they reached the turn toward her grandmother's street, Emily looked once more toward the sea and whispered to herself, maybe some echoes don't fade, maybe they just find their way back home. The next morning arrived with the kind of calm that follows an emotional storm. Not silence, exactly, but stillness. The sky over Windermere was pale and bright, and the sea shimmered as though it too had been holding its breath all night. Emily sat at her grandmother's writing desk, the letter once again in front of her. For days, it had stayed unopened, a quiet presence in the room, a question that had learned to wait. Daniel had offered to come by later, bringing copies of some documents he'd found, small pieces of history that might explain how their grandparents' paths had intertwined. Emily smiled at the thought. She had grown to trust his presence, not for what he could tell her, but for the peace that came when he simply listened. She turned the envelope over in her hands. The paper was delicate now, the ink faded but still graceful. Her grandmother's handwriting curved softly across the front. "To my dearest, Ellen." Emily hesitated. She wasn't sure if opening it would give her peace or take it away. But something inside her whispered that love, in all its forms, deserved to be heard. She broke the seal gently. The sound was quiet, but it felt enormous. Inside, the letter began simply. "My dearest Ellen, there is a truth I have carried quietly, not out of shame, but out of love. Years ago, before you were born, I met someone who changed my heart in ways I never expected. His name was William Reed. We shared nothing more than moments, conversations by the sea, letters that never reached their destinations, and a friendship that became something deeper, though never spoken aloud." Emily's breath caught. She could almost see it, two young people standing by the lighthouse, their laughter caught in the wind, their hearts trying to choose between love and duty. The letter continued. "When I learned I was expecting you, I made the decision to stay silent. William had a family, a life already built. I chose to protect you, to give you a name and a home free from confusion. Love, I realized, is not only about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go with grace." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she read the final lines. "If you ever find this, please know this. There was never a day I regretted loving or choosing the path I did. Some stories aren't told because they need no audience. They live in the quiet corners of our hearts, guiding us even when we don't realize it. Love always. Your mother's mother, Margaret." Emily folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her chest. The waves outside seemed to echo softly, as if the sea itself had been waiting to exhale.
When Daniel arrived later that afternoon, he found her standing near the window, the letter open beside her. She turned to him with eyes that glistened, not from sadness, but from understanding. "I read it," she said quietly. "Your father and my grandmother, they cared for each other, deeply, but they chose kindness over chaos." Daniel nodded slowly. "That sounds like him. My mother used to say he had a way of loving people gently, without ever hurting them." They both stood in silence, watching the tide roll in. The truth didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt human. Two hearts had crossed paths, made choices, and left behind something pure. A reminder that love, even unfulfilled, can still be good. Emily smiled faintly. "I thought this letter would change everything," she said. "But maybe it's not about what I found. Maybe it's about understanding why she hid it." He looked at her with quiet admiration. "She must have loved you very much to keep that kind of peace." Emily nodded. "She did." Later, they walked together to the lighthouse one last time. The late afternoon sun turned the water golden, and the air smelled of sea and wildflowers. The same wind that once carried her grandmother's laughter now brushed softly against Emily's hair. She took the letter from her pocket, reading one final line under her breath. Then, with a small smile, she folded it neatly and tucked it into the hollow of an old wooden post near the shore, not to hide it, but to let it rest where it belonged. Daniel watched quietly. "You're not keeping it." "I am, just not in my hands. Some stories are meant to stay where they began, between the waves and the wind." He nodded. "That's beautiful."
They stood side by side, saying nothing. The ocean moved steadily, eternal and calm. Emily felt lighter than she had in years. She realized that love isn't always about finding someone to stay. Sometimes, it's about learning from those who had to leave and carrying their grace forward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she turned to Daniel and smiled, not with longing, but with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, "for helping me find the truth." He returned her smile. Maybe the truth found us both. When Emily walked home that evening, the air was cool and bright with the scent of salt and new beginnings. The letter was gone, but its meaning stayed, a quiet lesson whispered through time. Some secrets don't need to be revealed to be understood. Some loves don't need to last to be real. And some hearts heal not by forgetting, but by finally forgiving. She looked back once more at the lighthouse glowing faintly in the distance and thought of her grandmother's voice, gentle and kind. "I never revealed that family secret, but maybe, in keeping it, I finally learned what love truly means." Some truths aren't meant to change our lives, only to remind us what truly matters. In the end, Emily didn't uncover a scandal. She uncovered love, quiet, imperfect, and endlessly kind. Her grandmother's secret wasn't about hiding the past. It was about protecting the peace of those she loved most. And maybe that's what love really is, not holding on, but knowing when to let go with grace. If this story touched your heart, remember, sometimes the most powerful truths live in silence. Thank you for listening to that one family secret I almost revealed. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us how beautiful it is to feel deeply, quietly, and honestly.